What if I told you that the man the entire world calls the ultimate symbol of strength cried himself to sleep in a bus station, sold his only companion for $50, and stood on the edge of a building in Switzerland seriously thinking about jumping? What if I told you that the face you've seen on 100 movie posters, the face that launched Rocky Balboa and John Rambo, the face that made a generation believe that no matter how hard life hits you, you can always get back up, that same face was damaged before he ever opened his eyes for the first time? What if the man Hollywood sold you as indestructible spent the most important years of his life being told he was worthless, disposable, and broken beyond repair? And what if I told you that after 50 years of fighting through poverty, rejection, homelessness, and public humiliation, after climbing to the absolute top of the entertainment world, the single thing that finally brought Sylvester Stallone to his knees was not a critic, not a failed film, not a collapsed career, but a phone call on a Tuesday morning in July 2012 that told him his son was gone? Because here is the truth that nobody talks about when they talk about Stallone. The story they sell you is the triumph. The story they leave out is the cost. Every punch Rocky threw, every jungle Rambo survived, every training montage that made you feel like you could run through a wall, all of it was drawn from a real life that was darker, lonelier, and more painful than any screenplay Hollywood would dare put on screen. This is that story. And once you hear it, you will never see Sylvester Stallone the same way again. Sylvester Stallone's first battle began before he ever drew breath. He was born on July 6, 1946, in a charity ward at Hell's Kitchen in New York City, and from the very first moment, the world came at him wrong. During delivery, doctors used forceps incorrectly. The instruments slipped. Nerves in the lower left side of his face were severed. The damage was immediate and permanent. The left side of his lip drooped. His cheek sagged. His tongue was partially paralyzed. His speech came out slurred, uneven, strained in a way that would follow him for the rest of his life. What should have been a routine birth became a sentence written into his body before he was even old enough to understand what a sentence meant. He would spend his entire childhood, his entire adolescence, and his early adulthood being reminded of that damage every single day. But the physical injury was only the beginning. Because the deeper wound, the one that took far longer to heal, and in many ways never fully did, came from the people who were supposed to love him anyway. His father, Frank Stallone Sr., was a man who interpreted his son's deformity as a personal embarrassment. Affection was rare. Approval was almost non-existent. The boy with the drooping lip and the slurred speech reflected badly on the image his father wanted to project. And so instead of protection, the child received distance. Instead of encouragement, he received shame. His mother, Jackie Stallone, was a woman driven by ambition and obsessed with status. She was unconventional, loud, and in her own way, deeply unhappy. She viewed her son not as a child who needed to be held and guided, but as an obstacle to the life she wanted. Love, when it came at all, was transactional. Attention was conditional. Stallone would later say plainly that growing up, he never truly felt wanted. He felt tolerated, but never wanted. When his parents divorced, the last thread of stability snapped. He was passed from relative to relative, placed in boarding schools, moved between institutions. There was no room that was ever fully his. No space he could point to and call home. School was no better. His slurred speech made him a perfect target. Classmates mimicked his mouth, contorted their faces into cruel imitations, turned his pain into their entertainment. Teachers, making assumptions the way adults often do when they encounter a child who does not fit neatly into their expectations, labeled him slow, difficult, disposable. The boy who spoke differently must think differently. The boy who looked broken must be broken. He was written off before anyone bothered to look closely enough to see what was actually there. And what was there was intelligence. Raw, fierce, unpolished intelligence that had nowhere to go because every door was closed before he could knock. So instead, the intelligence turned inward and then outward as rage. Anger replaced words because words had always failed him. Fists replaced explanations because explanations were never heard. By the time he reached his teenage years, Stallone had been expelled from more than a dozen schools. Not because he lacked the capacity to learn, but because rage had become the only language that made people stop laughing. The world had decided who he was before he ever got the chance to speak. And slowly, under the weight of relentless rejection, he began to believe it too. At 16, his mother made a decision that would mark him for decades. She sent him to a boarding school in Switzerland. Not because she saw opportunity for her son. Not because she believed in his potential. But because she needed him gone. Stallone would later say it felt like being thrown away. He arrived in a foreign country, barely speaking the language, surrounded by strangers who had no context for who he was or where he came from. Isolated. Unwanted. Invisible in a new way that was somehow even lonelier than the old way. The anger that had once kept him standing began to turn inward. Depression settled in quietly but completely. Days stretched with no purpose. Nights went on endlessly. For the first time in his life, Sylvester Stallone seriously considered ending it. He stood near the edge of a building and thought about jumping. He thought about whether anyone would notice. He thought about whether the world would be meaningfully different without him in it. What stopped him was not hope. It was not a moment of clarity or a flash of purpose. What stopped him was something rawer and less poetic than that. It was stubbornness. A refusal so deep it almost felt involuntary. If he disappeared quietly, every person who had ever dismissed him would have been right. And something inside him could not allow that. He returned to the United States with nothing. No degree. No plan. No money. Only a damaged face, a fractured past, and a dream so absurd that speaking it out loud invited ridicule. He wanted to be an actor. A profession built entirely on being seen and heard and accepted. For For a man who had spent his entire life being rejected for how he looked and how he sounded, it was almost a cruel joke. And yet it was the only dream that felt true. So he chased it into the most brutal version of reality imaginable. He arrived in New York City with $40 in his pocket. Casting rooms dismissed him in seconds. Some directors did not even let him finish speaking before they made their decision. Others were polite about it in the way that is somehow more humiliating than outright cruelty, smiling and suggesting he consider a different path. His face was wrong. His voice was wrong. His whole presence made people uncomfortable in rooms designed for people who made things feel easy and effortless. Rejection came so frequently it stopped feeling like individual events and started feeling like the weather. It was simply always there. Hunger became routine. He took every job available. He cleaned animal cages at the Central Park Zoo. He shoveled waste. He did whatever paid enough to survive, and often it did not pay enough to survive. When rent became impossible, he did not go home because there was no home to go to. He slept in bus stations. He curled up on benches and used his jacket as a blanket while security guards kicked him awake and moved him along. He sold his clothes. He pawned whatever he owned. He sold everything down to the last thing that mattered. His dog. His dog's name was Butkus, and that animal was his only companion. The one living being on Earth that did not look at him and find him lacking. One day, standing outside a liquor store in freezing cold, broke and starving and out of options, Stallone sold Butkus for $50. He stood there and handed over the leash to a stranger and watched his dog walk away. He said later that something broke inside him that day. Not because of the $50, not even because of the loneliness, but because it was proof that he had reached the very bottom. There was nothing left below this, and he still did not quit. The night everything changed arrived in 1975, and it arrived the way important moments often do, not with fanfare but with accident. Stallone was sitting in his cramped apartment, exhausted and uncertain of almost everything, when he turned on the television and found himself watching a boxing match between Muhammad Ali and a fighter named Chuck Wepner. Wepner was not a champion. He was not graceful or gifted or particularly skilled. He was a working-class man from New Jersey who was expected to get knocked out quickly and go home. Instead, Wepner absorbed punishment for 15 brutal rounds. He was battered and bloodied and outmatched in nearly every technical sense. He lost on points, but he finished the fight on his feet. And something about watching a man refuse to stay down when every reasonable argument said he should crack something open in Sylvester Stallone. He went home and he did not sleep. He sat down at a second-hand typewriter and he wrote for 3 days straight. He barely ate. He barely moved. He poured every rejection, every night in a bus station, every door slammed in his face, every teacher who called him slow, every casting director who would not let him finish speaking. Every morning he had woken up with $40 and a dream that felt delusional. He poured all of it into 90 pages about a nobody boxer from Philadelphia named Rocky Balboa. When he finished, he held the pages and understood that this was not a screenplay. It was a confession. The script began circulating in Hollywood, and for the first time in his life, doors opened. Producers called. Offers arrived. $75,000. Then $125,000. Then $250,000. For a man who had sold his dog for $50, these were numbers from a different universe. But every offer came attached to the same condition. Stallone could not play Rocky. The studios wanted a name, a face audiences already trusted, a voice that did not slur. They told him to take the money and go. Friends told him to take the money. His wife begged him to take the money. And Stallone said no. Every time. Not out of arrogance. Not out of some Hollywood fantasy about his own talent. But because he understood with perfect clarity that if he gave up the role, he would give up the only true thing he had ever made. Rocky was him. Without him in that role, it was just a story. With him, it was evidence. After weeks of refusals, the studio finally relented. Not because they believed in Stallone, but because his refusal had left them without a better option. They agreed to let him star in Rocky. His pay was cut to $35,000. The budget was slashed to barely $1 million. The shoot was compressed to less than a month. It was the smallest possible bet on the longest possible shot. Filming happened in Philadelphia in the dead of winter. The streets were cold and unforgiving. Equipment was borrowed. Extras were often unpaid locals who wandered in from the sidewalk. Scenes were rewritten the night before because there was no money for anything else. Stallone performed his own stunts and absorbed real punches because simulating pain cost more than enduring it. Every moment of the production balanced on the edge of collapse. But for Stallone, underneath the fear and the exhaustion, there was something he had almost forgotten the feeling of. Purpose. He was not performing someone else's vision. He was telling the truth. And truth, even when it is uncomfortable and imperfect and shot on a shoestring budget in freezing weather, has a way of finding its audience. When the first paycheck came in, Stallone did not buy himself anything. He tracked down the man who had bought his dog. He paid $15,000 to get Butkus back. He said he did not care what it cost. That dog had been his only companion at the lowest point of his life. Getting him back felt like reclaiming a part of himself that he thought he had surrendered forever. Rocky premiered on November 21, 1976. Critics were cautious. A low-budget boxing film led by an unknown actor with a drooping lip and a slurred voice did not look like a recipe for anything except failure. But audiences saw something that critics were not looking for. They saw themselves. They saw struggle without polish. Hope without guarantees. A man who was not the best, not the most talented, not the most gifted, just a man who refused to stop. Rocky spread through word of mouth like something contagious. It earned over $200 million worldwide. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture. And Sylvester Stallone stood on that stage, nominated for both Best Actor and Best Screenplay. The man who had been told his face did not work, whose voice made casting directors uncomfortable, whose presence Hollywood had rejected again and again. He stood there, and the world could not look away. Success arrived all at once and brought everything with it. Rocky II followed and dominated. Then Rocky III, built around the now legendary Eye of the Tiger, faster and louder and even more confident. Then Rocky IV, which arrived during the height of Cold War tension and became something beyond entertainment. It became a cultural event. A boxing match between an American underdog and a Soviet machine that audiences around the world turned into a symbol of something larger than sport. The film grossed hundreds of millions globally and cemented Stallone not just as a star but as an icon. And then there was Rambo. Where Rocky was about perseverance, First Blood was about damage. It was a film about a veteran who had survived a war only to discover that his country had no place for him when he came home. Rambo was not a hero in the conventional sense. He was a man destroyed by the very system that had created him, now wandering through a world that could not understand what it had done. Audiences responded to it with an intensity that surprised everyone. The sequels followed and exploded into phenomena that turned Stallone into something unprecedented. The most recognized action star on the planet, with two separate franchises running simultaneously, each one representing a different kind of pain. By the mid-1980s, he was the highest-paid actor in the world. His per-film salary reached numbers that felt mythological. He owned multiple homes and moved through a world of extraordinary privilege and comfort. Magazine covers, invitations from world leaders, total cultural dominance. But behind all of it, a pressure was building that no amount of money or fame could contain. To maintain the physical image his audience demanded, Stallone trained at a level that damaged his body in ways that would compound over time. Injuries accumulated and were quietly absorbed. Every film demanded he be bigger, harder, more indestructible than the last. There was no room for vulnerability, no room for aging, no room for the complexity that had always been there beneath the muscle and the mythology. The industry no longer wanted the writer who had poured himself onto 90 pages in 3 sleepless days. They wanted the brand, and brands only exist to perform. The 1990s arrived and Hollywood moved on the way it always does, suddenly and without apology. Taste shifted. Younger faces appeared. The sincerity and physical dominance that had defined Stallone's appeal were reframed as excess. Irony was in, earnestness was out, and Stallone, who had built everything on the foundation of genuine emotion, found himself on the wrong side of a cultural tide he had not seen coming. The failures were rapid and public. Stop, or my mom will shoot became a punchline before audiences even had a chance to form an opinion. Stallone later admitted he had been maneuvered into the project through deliberate misinformation about who else was involved. It did not matter. The damage was done. Then came Judge Dredd, a massive budget that collapsed into a massive disappointment. Then Assassins. Then Daylight. Each project stripped a little more credibility from the name that had once guaranteed a line around the block. The asking price dropped. The script stopped arriving. Meetings ended with polite smiles and no callbacks. Late-night hosts found his name useful as a reliable setup for an easy joke. Articles were written declaring him finished. His era was over. His relevance had expired. Financial pressure came with it. Years of extravagant spending, expensive divorces, and investments made during flush times became burdens that grew heavier as the income slowed. He sold properties. He reduced his life. Friends who had surrounded him at his peak found reasons to disappear. The thing about decline is that it is lonely in a way that success is never lonely, because success brings people and decline reveals which ones were ever really there. Stallone admitted in interviews from this period that he feared he would never work again, that the invisibility of his childhood had returned to find him, this time dressed in a tuxedo and surrounded by cameras. The form was different, but the feeling was the same. Unwanted. And then came the loss that made all of it, the poverty and the rejection and the humiliation and the failed films and the public mockery, feel small by comparison. Because none of that was grief. None of that was this. On a morning in July 2012, Sage Stallone was found dead in his Los Angeles home. He was 36 years old. He was Sylvester Stallone's firstborn son, the child who had been born into his father's ascent and had watched from close range, as the man who would become a global symbol of strength had also been, at home, a flawed and complicated and sometimes absent father still learning how to be present. Sage had walked through every phase of his father's life with him, the triumphs and the collapses and the quiet seasons in between. And now he was gone. Just gone. On an ordinary Tuesday in July. Stallone did not make a statement for weeks. There were no controlled press releases, no carefully shaped narratives, no performance of grief for public consumption. People who knew him described him as hollowed out. The man who had absorbed rejection for decades, who had slept in bus stations and sold his dog and been told 100 different ways that he did not belong, was undone by something that had no opponent and no solution and no training that could prepare you for it. He said later that losing a child is a wound that never heals. It is something you learn to carry. And some days, he said, even carrying it feels impossible. His work continued after that, because stopping meant facing silence too loud to sit with. But the performances changed. When he returned to Rocky Balboa in Creed, playing an aging man navigating cancer and loss and the weight of memory, there was no performance happening in the conventional sense. Stallone was not acting his way into grief. He was already living inside it. Every pause, every quiet look at nothing, every line delivered with restraint rather than volume. All of it was real. The Academy recognized what they were seeing and gave him a nomination. It was not validation. It was acknowledgement of honesty. In the years that followed, Stallone worked steadily and deliberately. Creed 2 and later Creed 3 showed a man who had stopped trying to be what audiences expected and started allowing himself to be what time had made him. Tulsa King brought him to television and revealed a performer comfortable in his own skin in a way that the young man sleeping in bus stations could never have imagined. He trained daily, not to chase the physical standard of his peak years, but to maintain discipline as a practice in itself. Strength was no longer about spectacle. It was about continuity. At home, surrounded by his wife Jennifer and their 3 daughters, he found something he had spent most of his life searching for without knowing exactly what it was. Grounding. His daughters, he has said, gave him a reason to soften without breaking. Financially secure and respected again on his own terms, he turned outward. Scholarships. Quiet donations. Support for young people from backgrounds like his own. People who had been told they were too broken, too different, too marked by circumstances beyond their control to ever become anything. He remembered exactly what that felt like. He had not forgotten. He never forgot. And yet the grief is still there. It does not leave. The paralysis still marks his face. The memory of selling his dog still lives somewhere inside him. The nights in bus stations. The casting directors who would not let him finish a sentence. The father who treated his deformity as a personal embarrassment. The mother who sent him away. None of it dissolved into the success. It all came along. And above all else, the loss of his son remains the one wound that no award and no box office number and no amount of time has healed or will heal. Sylvester Stallone is not a symbol of invincibility. He never was, even when the industry was selling him as one. He is a symbol of something harder and less cinematic and more true. He is a symbol of endurance. Not the movie version of endurance where the music swells and the underdog rises in slow motion to claim victory. The real version. The version where you keep moving not because you feel strong, but because stopping feels worse. The version where you carry things that never fully lighten and you show up anyway. The version where some fights are genuinely unwinnable and you lose them and you go on. Rocky Balboa was never just a character. He was a confession that a man with a damaged face and $40 and a secondhand typewriter wrote in 3 sleepless days because it was the only way he could tell the truth about himself. And when Stallone returned to that character in later years, older and heavier and marked by loss that no screenplay had ever prepared him for, the line between what was real and what was fiction disappeared completely. Because the pain on screen was real. It had already been lived. Every frame of it. At 78 years old, Sylvester Stallone is not perfect. He is not the image. He limps. He grieves. He carries wounds that have not closed and likely never will. But he is still here. Still moving. Quietly and stubbornly and one step at a time. And if that is not the most Rocky Balboa thing imaginable, then nothing is.